The motion before us. The greatest art is not produced by happiness. It is produced by the encounter with loss, failure, mortality, and the limits of the self. At the table tonight, the empiricist, who tests every claim against what we can actually verify and treats biography as data rather than romance. The geographer, who thinks in the shape of particular lives in particular places and knows that the universal only shows itself through the concrete. And the essayist, who finds patterns in how we live now and asks whether what we believe about the past is really a story we are telling ourselves about the present. What is at stake is not whether suffering ennobles, a claim no serious person would defend, but whether transformative work requires the shattering of comfortable illusion, whether safety produces mastery but not breakthrough, whether the art that changes what a form can do comes disproportionately from people who have been brought to the edge of what they thought they could bear. We are speaking in 2026, inside societies that have systematically reduced certain kinds of suffering and are now discovering what else they may have reduced. The question is not whether we should seek pain. It is whether we can produce the work we claim to value without it. Empiricist, make your case.
We have a methodological problem masquerading as an aesthetic question. The claim is that great art requires suffering. The evidence offered is invariably biographical. Beethoven was deaf, Van Gogh was mad, Plath put her head in an oven. But we are committing a sampling error so elementary it would embarrass an undergraduate. We are selecting on the dependent variable. We notice the suffering artists who succeeded and ignore the far larger population of suffering artists who produced nothing of consequence, alongside the rather substantial number of artists working in conditions of reasonable stability who produced work that survived. The pattern is this. We remember Caravaggio fleeing Rome after killing a man. We forget the 30 competent painters of his generation whose lives were uneventful and whose work hangs in no museum. Then we conclude that the murder caused the genius. That is not evidence. That is anecdote elevated to theory because it satisfies our narrative preferences. Here is a better test. East and West Germany, 1949 to 1989. A natural experiment in artistic conditions. The East German state provided guaranteed employment, housing, and pensions to artists who towed the line, comfortable, constrained, ideologically being-entered. West Germany offered precarity, freedom, and the commercial market. Which system produced more transformative work? West Germany, unambiguously. The directors, the composers, the novelists who are still studied came overwhelmingly from the West. But notice what was not required: destitution. What mattered was freedom to fail, not the inevitability of failure. Fassbinder made 44 films before dying at 37, not because he was starving, but because the structure around him allowed relentless experimentation. He had funding, distribution, collaborators. What he did not have was safety from his own choices. That distinction between productive instability and mere deprivation is what the Romantic formulation obscures. Poverty does not produce art. Tuberculosis does not produce art. What produces art is the collision between capability and constraint, and that collision can occur at many levels of material security. The falsifiable claim: if suffering itself were the engine, we should find great art emerging at equal rates from all populations under duress. We do not. We find it emerging from populations with literacy, technical training, institutional support, and an audience, who then encounter something that forces the work beyond competence. The suffering is not the cause. It is the catalyst that only works when the structure is already in place.
The empiricist is right to insist on structure. An artist is not a disembodied talent floating in the ether. They need tools, a tradition to work with or against, and a place to do the work. But a structure is not just a set of institutions. It is a geography, and a geography can be lost. There is a profound difference between the calculated precarity of an artist in a functioning society and the brute fact of dislocation. The former is a risk chosen. The latter is a world removed. This is the difference between a filmmaker in West Berlin securing his next grant and an entire population being uprooted by the failure of a landscape and an economy. Consider the single most significant internal migration in American history: the movement of some 5 million Black Americans out of the rural South between roughly 1910 and 1970. This was not a talent development program. It was a flight from the collapsing economics of sharecropping and the intimate terror of the Jim Crow regime. It was a population losing its place. And this dislocation created a new sound, a new art. Let us be specific. Consider a man named McKinley Morganfield driving a tractor on the Stovall Plantation near Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1943. He is a masterful player of acoustic Delta blues, a music tied to the front porch, the small gathering, the sound of a specific landscape. He moves to Chicago. In the dense, loud, industrial geography of the South Side, his acoustic guitar cannot be heard. It is simply swallowed by the noise of the city. So he buys an amplifier. He plugs his guitar into the electric grid. And what happens next is not merely a technical upgrade. It is a formal rupture that demands new technique, new phrasing, new relationship between the player and the instrument. The slide that once evoked a field holler now sustains and snarls in ways the Delta tradition had no language for. An entirely new vocabulary of bends, of held notes riding the electric current, had to be invented from scratch. Not in a studio workshop, but under the pressure of simply being heard. The Chicago blues is not merely the Delta blues made louder. It is the sound of migration itself. It carries the memory of the Mississippi mud, but its texture is the metallic grind of the factory. Its rhythm is the relentless pace of the city. That new vocabulary was not designed. It was forced into being because the old one could not survive the crossing. This art was not produced by a comfortable life. It was produced by the loss of a world. The suffering was not a catalyst that acted upon a stable structure. The breaking of the old geography was the structure from which the new art was forced to grow. The empiricist's model accounts for the artist who has a safety net to fall into. It cannot account for the artist who discovers the ground is gone.
Both the empiricist and the geographer treat the production of art as a question of external conditions, whether those conditions are institutional protections or the sudden removal of an entire landscape. They share an unexamined premise that the audience for such art remains constant in its appetite. The record of what millions are actually choosing suggests otherwise. Across developed societies, the dominant behavioral shift is not toward greater exposure to constraint, but toward its systematic reduction at the level of daily life. One measurable expression is the sustained rise in single-person households. In the United States, this share moved from roughly 17% of all households in 1960 to 28% by the most recent census counts. Parallel increases appear in Britain, Germany, and the Nordic countries over the same span. The decision registers as preference, not coercion. People with rising real incomes and expanded digital options elect to live alone, to schedule their own time, and to curate their social contacts through platforms that can be muted or abandoned at will. This pattern is not neutral with respect to the motion. It shows a population using material security to purchase insulation from the very frictions, unpredictable dependence, unchosen proximity, the daily evidence of other people's limits that earlier generations encountered as ordinary conditions of adult life. The same cohort continues to consume art, yet the consumption is overwhelmingly of forms engineered for variable interruption and low residual demand. Algorithmically sorted playlists, short video loops, on-demand series designed for background attention. The behavioral signature is therefore double: withdrawal from situations that impose involuntary encounter paired with a market reward for cultural products that simulate intensity without requiring sustained attention or personal cost. If the biographical record of earlier transformative work is indeed dense with loss and dislocation, the current record of revealed preference indicates that those conditions are now treated as optional and, on the whole, undesirable. The comfortable life does not merely fail to produce certain kinds of art, it is being actively selected at scale. When you say the collision between capability and constraint can occur at many levels of material security, what explains the post-2008 surge in Americans acquiring gym memberships, which by 2019 reached a record 82 million subscribers, while average active usage collapsed to fewer than 2 visits per month? a pattern that shows capability expanding while the friction that once made physical discipline unavoidable is being systematically engineered away at scale.
The question is well-formed. The answer is that you have isolated the wrong dependent variable. Completion rates measure convenience, not engagement. The question is not whether people finish what they start streaming. The medium was designed to fail that test. But whether populations still seek encounters with difficulty when they are not required to. They do vinyl album sales in the United States have grown to roughly $1 billion annually by recent industry estimates, a format that requires you to flip the record, that forces you to hear the sequence the artist intended, that cannot be skipped without physical effort. The audience for live orchestral performance in major American cities has held steady at around 30 million tickets per year since 2000, despite ticket prices rising faster than inflation. These are choices to accept constraint where none is imposed. The essayist's framing assumes that lowered barriers to exit prove lowered tolerance for difficulty. What if it proves something simpler, that infinite choice produces different browsing behavior, while commitment to a particular artist or form remains unchanged? Consider that the novel as a form has been declared dead approximately every decade since the 1960s, yet literary fiction exceeding 400 pages, Knausgaard, Ferrante, Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, commands enormous readerships and serious critical attention among audiences who could spend that time on shorter, easier work. The friction is the point. Coltrane and Davis made their most uncompromising records for audiences who had dozens of choices. Drake's audience has millions and still sits with 80-minute album-length projects. The question the essayist should ask: if comfort erodes the appetite for difficult art, why do the wealthiest urban populations pay the most to hear it live? The geographer's case rests on the claim that the Great Migration produced transformative art because it was the loss of a world, that the breaking of an old geography forced new forms into being. But if suffering itself is the causal engine, why did the Irish famine of the 1840s, 1 million dead, another million emigrated within 5 years, entire townlands emptied within a generation, not produce a comparable formal rupture? Irish music continued. Keening traditions continued. The literary output of the diaspora in Boston and New York expanded, but neither invented a new form in the way Chicago blues did. What distinguishes the suffering that produces formal innovation from the suffering that produces only continuity in a new vessel?
The empiricist puts his finger on a genuine weakness in my initial formulation. You are right to say that mere dislocation is insufficient, and your challenge using the partition of India is precise and correct. Let me refine the claim. The variable that matters is not the scale of dislocation, but the degree of civilizational translation required. Consider the painter El Greco. He arrived in Toledo in 1577, having trained in Venice under Titian, carrying a fully formed visual grammar of Venetian Renaissance naturalism. What Toledo demanded of him, the mystical intensity of Counter-Reformation Spain, its arid light, its vertical spiritual hunger, was so alien to everything his training had prepared him for, that his Venetian toolkit was not merely insufficient, it was actively misleading. The result was not a refinement of what he already knew. The elongated figures, the acid greens and livid whites, the compressed spatial logic. These were not Venetian technique applied to new subject matter. They were the wreckage of Venetian technique, rebuilt from salvaged parts into something no prior tradition had licensed. Compare that to Velázquez, who also worked under Spanish patronage but was native to its assumptions. His genius is undeniable, but his formal vocabulary did not shatter and reconstitute itself. It deepened. That is the distinction. It is the difference between a river changing course and a river changing into a glacier. So the question is not about suffering, but about the obsolescence of tools. Which losses render an entire artistic vocabulary bankrupt, and which can still be spoken of in the old grammar? The essayist, you argue that we are choosing comfort, abandoning the friction of demanding art for the ease of the stream. If that is so, what do we make of the actual ecology of our cultural institutions? In cities from Chicago to Glasgow, the independent theaters and experimental music venues where difficult new work is forged are closing. Not because audiences have stopped caring, but because their funding bodies have withdrawn, their grants have dried up, their charitable status has been challenged. Their opponent is not aesthetic cowardice, it is the accountant. The fight is over the balance sheet. Is this a crisis of aesthetic will, as you claim? Or is it simply a crisis of institutional finance, where the logic of austerity eliminates the very spaces where frictionful art could be born, regardless of demand?
The question isolates a genuine mechanism. Municipal licensing regimes in several mid-sized European cities have quietly reclassified mixed-use cultural buildings as residential property since the early 2010s, eliminating rehearsal infrastructure independent of any collapse in artistic demand. Yet the same populations that once sustained those buildings now direct discretionary time toward curated subscription boxes, algorithmically sequenced playlists, and on-demand lecture series that allow a listener to abandon a difficult idea at the precise moment of resistance. That redirection of attention treats the experience of being held inside something unresolved as a defect to be engineered away rather than a condition worth enduring. The regulatory erosion of working cultural infrastructure therefore amplifies an already visible appetite for the exit ramp over the longer passage through difficulty.
The question beneath the question is this: can a culture that has made suffering optional still produce the art that requires it? Or have we built a world that must choose between its comfort and its masterpieces? We are in 26. Spotify has more music than any civilization has ever heard. We can exit anything, block anyone, curate every input. The essayist says we are choosing insulation at scale. The empiricist says we still seek difficulty when we want it. The geographer says the tools are being priced out before we can discover whether we'd use them. But here is what I want to know. The algorithm has been watching us for 15 years now. It knows what we finish, what we skip, how long we linger, what we return to. It has more data on our actual relationship with difficulty than we have ever had about ourselves. And it is not recommending Coltrane. It is not recommending the 30-minute track. It is recommending the thing we are statistically most likely to complete. So, are we inside the transition right now? Are we the last generation raised on the old compact? That great art might require something from you. Now watching a younger cohort for whom that premise sounds as alien as arranged marriage. And are we capable of seeing that from inside, or will we keep believing we still want what the data shows we have already stopped choosing? Essayist, what are we actually selecting for?
The host asks what we are selecting for. The premise is that we are still the ones doing the selecting. I fear the geology has shifted beneath our feet. The algorithm is not a passive mirror of our desires, it is an active shaper of the terrain. It is infrastructure, and like all infrastructure, it has a bias. It makes certain paths easy and others nearly impossible. Consider a man in Kinshasa. Let's call him Jean-Paul Makambo. He is a musician. His instrument is a lekembe he built himself from refrigerator condenser fins and the metal from a discarded car door. For 2 decades, his music has been part of the city's sonic landscape. The specific feedback loop of the neighborhood bar, the wedding party, the funeral procession. His art is a direct translation of the material constraints of his place. It is brilliant, and it requires attention. Now, for the first time, his youngest son has a smartphone. The algorithm that feeds it does not know the acoustics of Jean-Paul's neighborhood. It knows only the frictionless, globally legible grammar of Nigerian Afrobeats and American pop. It has built a superhighway from Lagos and Los Angeles into that small room in Kinshasa, and it carries traffic in only one direction. Jean-Paul's son is not choosing to abandon his father's music. He is simply following the path of least resistance that has been bulldozed into his world. What is being selected for is not comfort over difficulty. It is placelessness over place. The algorithm functions as a global gentrifying agent. It finds unique, complex, local ecosystems of creation and replaces them with a monoculture that is profitable at scale. Jean-Paul is not being priced out of a venue in Austin. His entire musical geography is being rendered obsolete. The great loss here is not that we might stop choosing difficult art. It is that we are building a world where fewer and fewer people ever get the chance to make it.
The geographer correctly identifies how terrain reshapes possibility, yet the single transmission from father to son understates the active participation of producers themselves. Artists are not merely displaced by external recommendation engines, they migrate toward legibility in measurable numbers. Consider the documented shift among musicians from high-density traditional scenes who relocate to a handful of production hubs. Between 2010 and 2022, the share of new signings to major international labels originating from outside the United States, United Kingdom, and Sweden rose sharply. Yet the contracts increasingly included clauses for co-writing with in-house teams and delivery of stems optimized for playlist placement. These are not passive victims of recommendation bias. They are agents calculating that local forms carry lower expected returns once distribution scales. The deeper pattern appears in what they stop doing once the move is made. Regional rhythmic densities thin. Harmonic palettes narrow to those already dominant in global top-stream tracks. Public statements from the artists themselves record the calculation. Interviews in the early 2020s repeatedly cite the need for international ear as justification for dropping local languages or microtonal inflections that earlier generations treated as non-negotiable. Behavioral data at the aggregate level shows the consequence the single Kinshasa room cannot capture. The proportion of new releases carrying credits from 3 or more countries increased steadily after 2015, while domestic-only releases in the same markets declined. This is not audience demand alone. It is supply adapting in advance of demand, because the publishing and licensing architecture now prices visibility in units of cross-border compatibility. Much as the standardization of rail gauges in the 19th century did not merely reflect existing freight patterns, but actively determined which towns would industrialize and which would remain peripheral, regardless of what any individual station master preferred. The result is not simply fewer difficult works. It is the quiet professionalization of exit among those who once sustained the local vocabularies. When the next generation in those same places encounters the tradition, what they meet is already a residual category rather than a living practice.
The essayist and the geographer have both identified real mechanisms: professionalization of exit, infrastructure, pricing, visibility, but they share an assumption I want to test directly. They assume we can measure what the platform has done to us by watching what it recommends. That gets the causation backwards. Here is what we can verify. Research on adult attention spans for continuous reading has produced contested findings, and attention scientists note that the concept of a single, measurable, average attention span may itself be methodologically suspect. But the same populations showed no decline in sustained attention for tasks they had chosen and committed to in advance: chess tournaments, marathon training, difficult video games with 100-hour completion times. What changed was not capacity. It was the moment of commitment. The platform does not shorten attention. It delays the decision to pay it. This maps precisely onto a well-studied phenomenon in epidemiology: the distinction between incidence and prevalence. A disease can appear to be spreading, prevalence rising, while new infections are actually declining, simply because people are surviving longer with the condition. Observers who read the prevalence data without disaggregating it reach the wrong conclusion about the direction of travel. The musical ecology the geographer described in Kinshasa functioned on prevalence logic. What survived locally did so because it had time to embed before being challenged. The streaming environment operates on incidence logic. It measures what is being newly contacted right now, at every moment, across every market simultaneously. What looks like a declining appetite for difficulty may be a measurement artifact. We are counting first exposures and calling them verdicts. But here is where the analogy breaks and becomes interesting. In epidemiology, we can eventually separate incidence from prevalence with longitudinal cohort data. With streaming behavior, those cohorts are structurally compromised. The platform redesigns the environment mid-study, so you cannot hold conditions constant. The essayist's data on declining completion rates suggests the system is selecting for a trait, initial click, that does not predict the second trait we claim to care about, which is sustained return. The methodological error both speakers make is treating the platform as a force acting on a static population. It is not. We are co-evolving with it. The question is not whether we still want difficulty. The question is whether we are building the muscle memory to recognize it before we swipe past it. That is a testable claim. Mount an eye-tracking study. Do users linger on difficult album descriptions shorter in 2025 than they did in 2015, or do they linger the same duration but convert to play at lower rates? If the former, the essayist, is right, appetite is changing. If the latter, something else is breaking at the moment of commitment.
The decisive pattern is populations that initiate artistic projects at rising rates while structuring their schedules so that no single work can demand the sustained cost of failure. Surveys of time allocation in several European countries show adults now reporting more hours logged under creative categories than 2 decades earlier, yet the same datasets record those hours scattered across multiple simultaneous starts rather than concentrated in one. This is the coevolution the numbers actually track, an infrastructure that monetizes the gesture of audition, the open mic slot, the self-published first chapter, the festival workshop portfolio, while allowing each attempt to expire quietly rather than forcing the reckoning that once came when a composer had staked a year on a single manuscript. The result is not the disappearance of difficult art, but its confinement to the shrinking fraction of lives still organized around irreversible stakes. Those who retain such organization continue to produce it. The larger society has simply made that organization optional and statistically rare.
The essayist is correct that we are building lives structured around optionality. The empiricist is correct that the crucial failure happens at the moment of commitment. But both speak as if the only terrain on which to live is the frictionless surface of the screen. I want to point to a different map. Consider Gary, Indiana. Since the great mills of U.S. steel began to cool half a century ago, the city has been a grammar of American failure. Now consider a young architect, let's call her Anna. She could have found a comfortable practice in a city that works. Instead, she is in Gary. She has bought a derelict church for less than the price of a used car. Her working rule is a constraint, not an aesthetic preference. She may only build with materials salvaged from other ruined structures within a 1-mile radius. Her commitment is not a click, but a mortgage on a collapsing roof. The north wall of her new structure is made from the terrazzo floors of a demolished 1950s department store, painstakingly cut and refitted. The load-bearing columns are not sleek steel, but laminated timbers reclaimed from a burned-out box factory. The resulting building is beautiful, but its beauty is severe. It is the architectural equivalent of a language with no synonyms. This is not the art of unlimited choice. It is the art that is possible after everything else has been taken away. The question is whether we are still willing to live in the places where it is geographically inescapable.
The motion asks whether great art requires suffering. I began believing the question was methodological, a sampling error dressed as philosophy. I end believing it is ontological, and the shift came in the geographer's partition challenge to me. I claimed suffering was catalyst, not cause. She forced me to admit I had no account for why some dislocations produce formal breakthroughs, while others produce only continuity under duress. The variable I missed, not suffering itself, but the time lag between production and recognition. Here is what we have not asked. The 20th century's canonical difficult works, Schoenberg's 12-tone system, Joyce's Ulysses, Rothko's late paintings, were made by artists who died before widespread acceptance. They worked in ignorance of whether anyone would care. That ignorance was structural. A composer in 1925 had no real-time data on who was listening. A painter had no dashboard measuring engagement. We now have both. The neuroscience literature on dopamine reward circuits shows that variable intermittent reinforcement, the slot machine pattern, is more behaviorally addictive than consistent reward. Every artist with an analytics panel now works inside that circuit. They can see, hourly, what is landing. The question is not whether we still value difficulty. It is whether anyone can sustain making it when the feedback loop has been shortened from decades to minutes, and the signal is overwhelmingly, "This is not working"? Can you produce transformative work while watching it fail in real time? Or does the breakthrough require you to make it in the dark?